And for that part of the conversation, we brought in a ringer. We have former State Rep Olsen, and he's going to introduce himself in a minute. And we're thinking that unless we really start taking way too long, that we will invite questions on Oliver's presentation as he's going along, because so everybody can kind of come along for the ride. So Oliver's slide deck is maybe 20-30 minutes. We've got time for questions. We have a lot of 90 minutes for today, so we're not in a hurry. So we'll start with Oliver's overview and background presentation, and feel free to ask questions on any slide. And then when Oliver's done, Seth and I are going to talk a little bit about what the legislature has done this year and what the legislature might be able to do going forward. So again, thanks to all of you for being here. We've really been looking forward to this conversation. Hope folks have a lot of questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Oliver.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm really happy I have an easy job because I'm the armchair quarterback. I get to look back at history. Seth and Kathleen have the difficult part, which is where we go from here. So as Kathleen mentioned, former state representative, I served in Montpelier representing Jamaica, Montpelier, Stratton, as a involved for a number of years. I also served on the State Board of Education for nearly 5 years, including a stint as the chair of the board. And in full disclosure, wear many hats, I am the moderator of the Taconic Green School District. I'm also an advisor to the Independent School Association, largely helping them manage some of the misinformation in Montpelier these days. But I'm here today as really just as a parent and a taxpayer, and that's certainly the only hat that I'm wearing here today. So I'm going to walk through some history of sort of Vermont's education system over the past 60 or so years, and Kathleen's point, so how we got to where we are today. And I know we're here, Kathleen and Seth are going to be talking about where we're going with education funding, but you really can't talk about education funding unless you're talking about the funding within the context of the overall system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I found this, I was up in the state archives and going through some old material, and I came across this quote from a former education commissioner. And it was talking about challenges in 1962 around state aid for education as being one of Vermont's most complex and stubborn problems, one which must be solved in education as never before. I would say it is certainly not anymore any less complex today than it was back then. So I think we really can't have a conversation about the challenges with our education system and education spending without really confronting the demographic reality that's facing not only our state, but quite honestly our nation. For those of you who subscribe to The Economist, there's a fascinating article in this week's paper. And I stole this little graph out of there, and it really illustrates. And this is shows the fertility rate since 1960 through last year, and over the last couple of years, we're now below as a nation below the replacement rate. And we're seeing that play out here in Vermont. I'll show you some stats on that. But this is the challenge that we're facing in Vermont. This has been known for a number of years. Art Wolf, who was a former state economist, and his partner produced a report back in 2008 and really sounded an alarm on what they saw, this sort of demographic challenge that's playing out in front of us today, particularly as it relates to the projections they saw with declining student enrollment and the impacts that it had on our state finances. So now I'm going to go back 60 years ago, and because it's really interesting. So 60 years ago, mid-1960s, we had a very different set of challenges facing our education system. And we had this perfect storm of issues that really played out in terms of the quality of our education system, the quality of our facilities. We had a lot of very small school buildings, both elementary schools. We had a ton ton of one-room schoolhouses still at that time. I knew people up in Jamaica, they remember as students cleaning out the outhouse in the one-room schoolhouse in Rossington. That's how recent this was. We had a lot of small high schools. And at the same time, in the 1960s and 70s, we had this rapid growth in our population. So we went from 389,000 people in 1960 to 511 in 1980. Coupled with that, we had, coming out of the first part of the 20th century, rather low participation rate at the high school level. So in 1948, only 46% of Vermont students actually graduated high school. A lot of kids in one-room schoolhouses, not many kids actually going around or completing high school. By 1965, that had risen to 75. So we had this challenge of all these small elementary schools. Some of these elementary schools in the 60s had class sizes of up to 50 in a single room. We had more kids going to high school, which is great, but they were going to high school in small high school buildings that were overcrowded and didn't have modern facilities. And then mid to late 1960s, a lot of Vermonters were going to schools that were run by the Catholic diocese. And due to societal changes, there was a rapid collapse of the parochial school system in Vermont. Just between 1967 and 1969, 16 parochial schools across the state closed, and it displaced 2,000 students. And it was such a crisis at the time, the legislature actually commissioned a task force to study this issue because they just didn't have the room to deal with these kids on top of all the other problems. Yes?
Why did they close?
Combination of factors. Workforce was a big one. So if you back, before the 1960s, we had, quite frankly, we had a lot of nuns. We had an education system. You think of the College of St. Joe de Pro in Rutland, where that were graduating a lot of nuns who became teachers. And you saw a sharp decline in those. In fact, this study that I was reading that the legislature produced, they actually pointed to the fact that they had to start hiring more lay people who demanded higher salaries, so they couldn't afford to operate these schools. And that was one of the big issues. So anyway, there was just this confluence of issues, in the mid to late 1960s. And you can see, as we're looking at the demographics and going from the 1960s all the way to, last year, if you tally up all the student population, you can see it peaked right around 1973. We had across both public schools, religious schools, the academies, independent schools, about 116,000 students. Last year, we had about 18,000 students. And what's really stunning is just how dramatic the drop-off has been since 2005. And it's across all sectors. As I mentioned, we had in the 1960s, over 10,000 students in parochial schools alone. Just the Catholic schools, that's down to 2,300. So, sharp drop across the system in all sectors. So going back to mid-1960s, there was all this growth we had and the infrastructure of buildings just weren't there to support it. So there's a gentleman named Governor Hoff, who was elected in 1963. Young guy, had big ambitions to make a lot of change in Vermont, and he did. In his legacy, there are a number of changes in human services, education, and many other areas. So one of the things he did after he was elected, his first year in office, he established a few different planning boards that looked at issues across the state. But one of them was an educational task force. And in October '63, this task force released their report, and their recommendations included the creation of a consolidation of school districts into 12 regional school districts. They wanted to substantially increase state funding for education from, at that point, was at 21%. They wanted to get it up to 40%. And they recommended 50% capital state construction aid to support the construction of all these new schools that we needed to support this, these increasing needs. And I pulled this out of, there was a little pamphlet and newspaper article at the time that had some just fascinating stats. So elementary, some of their findings were, the highlights of their findings were there was just vast inequity across the system. Elementary school classes range from 18 to 50 students. Today, I think we're lucky a lot of classes have 18 students. Many are much lower than that. But they had classes up to 50 students. The smallest high school in the state was at Middletown Springs. 7th through 12th grade, 38 students. 1964, January 7th, superintendent of the BRSU had, was really sort of excited about the governor's vision, and really, at the time, felt that his district was, was sort of a poster child of the problems we had statewide. He reached out to the governor and said, please, I want you to come down to our district and come on a tour. And the governor agreed and spent the entire day with the State Board of Education and the chairs of the House and Senate Education Committees. And I actually found in the state archives, they actually had a roster of all the cars, who was in which car, driving around to all these different schools. So all these little one-room schoolhouses in Tabor, Danby, Scottsville, which is in Danby, Sunderland, Pollock, Rupert, did the whole tour. And the governor and the other people that were here, they were absolutely shocked by what they saw. Comments, and this was the headline, it was just hard to believe. Coming into these, one-room schoolhouses and some, in places like Danby, and then going to, Manchester and seeing, a much more modern facility. So this was really kind of a pivotal moment, in the mid-60s. And it was only a month later, it was in February 1964, the state board adopted what they called the minimum education standards, which is the precursor to what we now have as education quality standards. And it was a set of standards that applied initially only to secondary schools. They started with secondary schools, and then a few years later on moved on to elementary schools. And set forth, there were a number of policy decisions that followed this tour. Brought out major change. So these standards essentially forced the closure of a number of schools across Vermont, high schools in particular. That's really where they targeted the closure, including a number of the historic academies. There were at least 3, possibly 4, I can't remember, historic academies that were closed as a result of this process. And replaced, in many cases, with union high schools. So the state, the legislature ended up agreeing, they didn't agree with all the governor's task force's recommendations, but agreed to a number of them, maybe a little bit more limited ways. So one of them was to establish state capital construction aid, where the state would kick in 30%, not 50% that was recommended, but 30%. And that money helped build a lot of these high schools as well as elementary schools that served larger regions and replaced a lot of these smaller schools. So, and this is important because, if you look around the state, you look at a lot of these buildings here, they all are of kind of a similar vintage. And if you think about the lifespan of a building, and you look at the calendar, and you look at where we're at today, we're going to come to this. So, now we start talking about funding, right? So, 1969 was, as part of this change, we really started to see a gravitation towards, more state support of education funding. And the first of these formulas came in 1969, it was known as the Miller formula. And essentially, there was state aid that supplemented local property tax revenues that was distributed in inverse proportion to each school district's property wealth. And the intent was to, basically result in about 40% state aid. So for every $100 that a school district needed in funding, the state would pay for 40%, and the local school district property taxes would contribute the other 60%. That was the goal, that was the target. The problem is, and you're going to see this was a theme throughout these formula, is whenever the legislature was short on money, the place they would always short money was the education system. So by 1979, the average state aid to school districts was down to 17%. So it just put more and more pressure on the backs of the property taxpayers. So 1982, they realized they have a problem, so they kind of reboot the formula. They add a few little bells and whistles to it, and this becomes the Morris Giuliani formula. Interestingly, they added an income factor, so when they were looking at the wealth of a district, they weren't just looking at property wealth, they were also looking at income as a measure of wealth. They also added a listing penalty, which was sort of a precursor to what we now know as the COA, to ensure that school districts weren't playing games with their local valuations, right? The intent was to ensure that there was, some equality in terms of the methodologies used to assess property from town to town. But once again, same problem. This gradually legislature, sort of reduces the amount of money that goes into the formula. More pressure gets put on property taxpayers. Property taxpayers start getting cranky. They call the legislators. Legislators, feel pressure to do something. So 1988 comes along, and we now have what's known as a foundation formula. And the idea is that it was designed to provide sort of, enough funding to provide a basic level of education. And then, but it still allowed districts to spend above that if they wanted to, provide, sort of extra resources to their school districts. So, once again, from 1988 to 1996, the formula, receives less and less state funding, and all of a sudden, it's not really providing for basic education, and more pressure is put on the property tax. This time, it sparks a court case that goes to the Supreme Court, which we all know is the Brigham decision. And as a result of that decision, the Supreme Court said, legislature, this foundational formula is fundamentally inequitable. We don't have a solution, but we need to go figure one out. So that gave us Act 60. So, Act 60 established a two-tiered funding system. But both were funded by a statewide property tax. And this was a big move to a statewide property tax. So there was, one property tax that provided a base amount, and then districts could spend above that base, but through kind of a convoluted formula, as they spent above that, they had to contribute to something known as a sharing pool, which was then redistributed to other districts to help them pay for any spending above that. It was, very complicated. It had a number of problems. One of the issues is the grant list. It was a single grant list. So residential and non-residential grant list was combined. And what happened was a lot of property wealthy districts found a loophole, and that is that they could create private foundations and go around to all the property taxpayers in the town and say, hey, you pay this much into the fund. We'll post your name out there so all of your neighbors know that you've paid into the fund. And if we all meet this target, we can, spend X millions of dollars on our school. It doesn't flow through the funding formula, and we don't take a hit on the property tax. So that was happening in a number of communities, and it was seen by many as undermining sort of the principles and goals of Act 60. So then in 2003, Act 68 rolls around, and what this did is essentially what it did is it split the grant list into two segments. Homestead property, meaning owner-occupied residential property, and everything else. So second homes, deer camps, commercial property, rental property, was all considered non-homestead property. And the non-homestead property was taxed at a uniform rate statewide. Everybody paid the same. Residential property had variable property tax that was based on per pupil spending. So this had the effect of sort of undermining these private foundations because a lot of the property wealth was with non-residential property. Those taxpayers no longer had an incentive to contribute to these private foundations, and foundations collapsed. So now we start getting, we get to 2015 and we really start feeling the pressure of these demographic issues that I mentioned before, right? We're starting to see real declines in our student enrollment. And I think it was in 2014, I actually served on the task force. Speaker of the House, Shaf Smith, had appointed myself and a number of other current former legislators to a task force to really sort of look at kind of structural challenges that we knew were coming. And one of the issues that we had, and this goes back to this recommendation that was made in 1963, we had a lot of school districts. You know, in 2014, I think we had 300 school districts across the state. And, you know, so when the problem, the challenge you have is when you have really small governance units, it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility to be creative, to be nimble, particularly to respond to these demographic challenges. So in 2015, the legislature came out with Act 46. And Act 46, just to be clear, did nothing for education finance reform whatsoever. It was all about governance reform. And it was really kind of forward thinking in terms of moving the state to larger governance units that would have the flexibility to respond within their own districts to some of the challenges that we saw then and we're seeing today. And we're starting to see some of this play out. If any of you have read, there's a story in some of the press up in Montpelier, Roxbury. That's an example. There was a merged district, and they have two elementary schools, or two or three elementary schools, and if you look at them all sort of, as a unit, there's a lot of excess capacity. The voters voted down the budget. They said, this is too expensive. We don't pay for this anymore. So the school board looked at it and they said, okay, well, the only way we're going to save money is if we close one building and we bus those kids to one of the other schools, because there's capacity, there's empty seats in those schools, and it's $1 million in savings. And those voters are going to go back to the polls again to vote on a budget with that assumption built into it. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but that is something that was not possible before Act 46, because prior to that, they were different districts and didn't have the capacity to have those conversations and those decisions. Act 127, so 2022, this had pretty profound impacts on our ed finance system. So essentially what this did, and I'm going to come to this at the moment, students are at the heart, obviously, of everything that we do. In the context of ed finance, how we count students is fundamental to what we do. Prior to Act 127, there was really no clear rationale for how we counted students for purposes of ed finance. So Act 127 set in motion a new methodology based on empirical data that demonstrated how different classes of students, different types of students, were more or less resource intensive to educate. And based on that analysis, came up with a way of weighting students to account for those differences. And it primarily, the weights are primarily influenced by geographic sparsity. So rural kids in rural communities, typically, are more expensive than kids in more densely populated areas for logistical reasons. Economies of scale are fairly obvious there. Students with special education needs, students from impoverished backgrounds. These are all, strongly correlated with cost to serve. So
these weights were adjusted, and these really resulted in significant changes in terms of the student counts from district to district, with really dramatic impacts. So the law included a property tax cap that was intended to soften the impact of communities negatively impacted by these weights. It was well intended, but perhaps had not been modeled out with human psychology in mind, and has resulted in is a significant factor in some of the chaos that we've seen in the past year. I'll leave it at that. So now we're today. I'm going to walk through just kind of Ed Finance 101, how the system as we know it today works. But some things to keep in mind, key local variables. Number one is, obviously, budgeted expenditures. Number two, really big, again, equalized pupils, right? How you count the students, really important. Fundamentally within our system, the tax rate, there's one thing you can walk away from this, I hope you all understand that. The tax rate is directly correlated to the cost per student, right? Doesn't matter how big or small the budget is, none of that really matters. The only thing that matters is the cost per student. That's what drives the tax rate. So the number of students you have, any revenues you have that are exempt, I call them non-taxable revenues that are exempt from the calculation. So these are private donations, endowments, federal funds. It's been a big issue over the last few years with federal COVID-related funding, other categorical grants, etc. Another big one. The size of the grant list does not and has not for many years had any impact on the local budget or the tax rate. So property values go up, they go down. That's not going to impact your education tax rate. So statewide ed fund. As I mentioned, with Act 60 and Act 68, we moved to a statewide education fund. And it's very complicated. It's really hard to explain. I'll do my best, but I'm not the best at it. Quite frankly, I haven't found anybody that does a great job explaining it, because it is very complicated. But a couple of concepts. So one, we have a giant pot of money in Montpelier with $2+ billion every year that comes in and goes out of the fund. Main revenue sources that go into the fund include non-residential property tax, residential property tax. Again, we now have statewide education property tax and have for a number of years. Other state revenues, notably sales and use tax, miscellaneous other consumption taxes, some small bits and bobs from the lottery and other stuff. It's all kind of peanuts compared to the big ones are really the sales and use tax and the property tax. And then on the right-hand side of the ledger, we've got our spending. So what happens every year, from January through March, April, we have school districts across the state that are assessing their needs. They're looking at how many students they have. Remember the equalized student count they have. The programs they want to deliver. They put together a budget. They put it out to the voters. The voters vote it up, they vote it down. And when the legislature has a pretty good sense of where all these are going to total up, right? They never know 100% because there's always some stragglers out there that haven't voted on their budgets. But when they have a pretty good sense, they add up all the spending, and then they look at how much revenue they need from these different sources to bring the fund into balance, right? It's a really tricky game. And then what that does is we get what's known as the yield, right? And what the legislature does is every year they pass what's now known as the yield bill, and that basically takes all those inputs, both the revenues and the expected expenditures, and says, okay, based on that, if with a $1 tax rate on the residential tax, and they also set the non-residential tax, and they say, okay, I said the non-residential tax at about 59, with a $1 tax per 100 on homestead property, that will yield $9,846 per student. Okay, is everybody following me so far? I know it's complicated, but hypothetically, let's just say we lived in an imaginary world where every school district spent the same exact sum of money, and they all spent $9,846. Your property tax would be $1 per 100. That would be your tax rate. Okay, so that is what gets voted out in Montpelier. And the way the formula works is for every district, basically they add up their budgeted expenses. I'll do a work example here in a moment. They take their budgeted expenses, divide that by the equalized pupils they have, and they get an education spending amount of this. And the tax rate is proportionate to this spending number. So if you go back here, $1 there yields $9,846. If you want to increase your spending up to $13,366, your tax rate is proportionally going to increase to
You want to
$1.35.
explain the equalized?
Yes, I'll come and equalize pupils. Next slide. So, here's a hypothetical example, and I took 2 years, FY24 and FY25, because I can highlight the changes with Act 127. So, equalized pupils, this year, for the upcoming year, FY25, in this hypothetical school district, 2,692 equalized pupils. Okay, those are not little people. They're not actual little people. They are the little people multiplied by those weights. So if you have, let's say, 1,000 kids, and of those 1,000 kids, 600 are high school students and 400 are elementary school students, the high school students might be worth 1.2, the elementary school students might only be worth 0.8. For those schools that are in poverty, they get another 0.5. Students who are in special education have another 0.2, so on and so forth. I'm making up numbers. That's the general idea. So then you multiply those weighting factors, and you now take 1,000 sort of little humans become 2,692 sort of inflated humans. That makes sense. Okay? Did that answer your question? Okay. So, a worked example here. Let's say a district votes a budget of $39.5 million, right? I mentioned before, there are these sort of non-taxable revenues. So they could, this could be federal funding, could be private, sort of, bake sale money, anything like that gets taken out of the equation. If you have money in reserves, you can take that out as well. So now what's actually taxable is $35.9 million. You divide the number of students into that number, and you get ed spending per equalized pupil of 13,066. You now divide that by the yield number that the legislature set, you get your local tax rate. Okay? So, just to make it more confusing, as I mentioned, Act 127 changed how we handle the weights. But again, that wasn't specific to this one district, it was across the state. All of the equalized pupils went up. So as you put more into the denominator, the numbers change. So the education spending in this district last year was $20,859, but only because there was a very different equalized pupil number. But as you can see here, the tax rate year over year is almost, the change is somewhat negligible. Okay?
So
follow me?
all of this, to be clear to people, the reason it stays almost equal is that this district really was in the middle of, you had a lot of districts that had lost under that new equation, some that won, and this district stayed
Exactly. And in this district here, this is a good example where Act 46 sort of paid dividends for this district because, the districts that are really struggling are those that are more confined to a geographic area, right? So I can think of one school district in the state that's essentially like one town, and they're getting absolutely hammered by Act 127 because they have, they're a relatively affluent town, don't have a lot of kids where English is a second language, not a lot of kids with special education needs, so their students don't get weighted as heavily as others, right? So their tax rate is going to go through the roof. This hypothetical district includes a number of towns, I think 9 if I remember. And within those towns, there's a good diverse mix of those factors. So when you pull them all together, it essentially worked out to be neutral.
So why would the base spending yield be so different if the tax rate remained pretty much the same?
You mean the
base spending yield.
oh, this? Oh, because of how the students were counted statewide. So I want to say, I think in FY24 statewide, I think there were maybe 84,000 equalized pupils. And then for FY25, it's like 145,000.
But let's just say there's 100,000 in the state. You can't then have, with your weights, 110,000. You always have to come back to the 100,000.
No. Because you can weight, you can put whatever multiplier you want on it. You could have 200,000 equalized pupils.
So in the old system, as you mentioned, a high school student could be 1.2, an elementary could be 8, but it still had to equal 100%.
It didn't, and it doesn't today. Yeah.
But the equalization process did sort of try to bring it back.
Yeah, well, the equalization is more from district to district. Right? So I guess the thing is, with equalized pupils per state, there's no attempt to try to get them to equal the actual number of students. I don't know if that helps. It's a purely artificial number.
Well, and the state gives it to the district. It's not something the district comes up with.
Correct, but it's based on the data within the district, and there's a calculation.
How do they assess poverty as compared to affluence? Where does that come from? The taxes?
No.
The individual taxes that are paid?
No, it comes from a variety of data sources, and Randy can probably answer on the ground operational how it works. But
The simplest is we submit data from the supervisory union from each district to the agency of education. They know all the demographics of all of our students, and then they put that information into the formula, and then it spits out the actual number of equalized pupils for long-term student membership. So we submit it, they put all the weights on it, and then they give us back a number.
Does every district keep the same
Data, yes.
data?
The state
And-
requires,
And who sets the data? I mean,
the state.
how you gather?
Yeah, the state tells
State
us we have to submit it in the format that they want, and if there's mistakes, they're corrected, and it goes back and forth until all the data is accurate. Then they give us their weights, and sometimes there's mistakes, and so then we go back and forth because we question some of what they do, and eventually we get to a place where their numbers and our numbers will reconcile, and then that's what's used.
by the way, Randy, this is Randy Wilkes, the superintendent.
Yeah. Thanks, Randy.
Kathleen.
I wanted to just chime in on this a little bit because I had I won't say pleasure or displeasure, I had the experience of serving on the summer and fall task force that updated these weights. And it was a really interesting experience because we went way back into the history of, whenever back in time on one of Oliver's slides that we first started weighting students. We first started statistically acknowledging the fact that, hey, we think it costs more to educate students in a really sparse rural district than it does in a dense district. Or we think it might cost more to educate students in poverty. Or we think it might cost more to educate, you know, these different categories. Students for whom English is a second language, for example. And the thing that was really, really interesting about this was that when you went back into the history, the empirical or statistical foundation of those very first weights was very weak.
I think it was absent.
It was, I was trying to be, it was very weak. Somebody went into their barn for us and found a cardboard box of stuff and said, gee, you know, we remember those hearings, and this goes way back in time, right? And the legislature has turnover. We brought people in who had been around at that time. So the original weights weren't empirically sound. And so in 2018 or 19, the legislature set aside money to hire a team of mathematicians and educational consultants who know what they're doing. And they spent several years working with the AOE, working with the school districts, working with national experts, but mostly basing the data on real live information that our schools were submitting to them. They did do a good job. And they came back with a very thick report that said, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it today, but it very clearly mathematically quantified students in poverty cost twice as much to educate. Students who are English as a second language cost 1.5. And so we adopted, after weeks of testimony, months of testimony, hours of public hearings, and then a full legislative process, we adopted the new independently verified, mathematically statistical weights into our education formula. And we'll talk a little bit more about the thing that we did wrong when we passed that bill, but the new weights are mathematically sound, and I don't think you will find too many people who don't believe that. It's a good way of saying, hey, you know, Taconic and Green has X% of kids who are on free and reduced lunch. Let's make sure they get the resources they need to provide those students the services they need. Okay.
Cool, yes, in fact.
I just have, I think it's interesting about how you come up with the tax rate. The real problem is the voted budget. That went up 6.3% year over year. You can't continue to do that. I mean, and expect the electorate to pay for this.
Well,
Is there any lid on that? I mean, how do they determine that?
Well, that's why we do live in a democracy, and that it is up to the voters. And you know, the reality is that you know, every district's going to be different, and we've seen across the state there are districts where, you know, budgets have been soundly defeated because the voters don't, you know, think that the increases are too high. But another thing that's really interesting with, I mean, one of the challenges we have with this system, and the frustration, I think, collectively that we all share in the system, is everyone is in control, yet no one is in control, right? Because all the decisions are made at the local level, which is phenomenal, which is great, but we all share those decisions, right? So that is the sort of tension that we constantly face with the system that we have today. And it's complicated. So people, you know, they're frustrated because they don't understand it. And it feels like the decisions are out of their hands, even though they are. These are all decisions that voters are making, or in some cases not making. So I do want to just return to the weights. So, you know, we had big changes with the weights and caused some, you know, pretty dramatic changes from district to district. And one thing, you know, that I've found really intriguing as I've looked at school budgets that have failed across the state this year is that many of the districts that are seeing budgets fail are actually districts that, I hate to say there are winners and losers, but there are no winners and losers from Act 127. And there are a number of districts that were winners in Act 127. Yet they also have, many of these happen to be the same school districts that are going down the budgets, which is a really interesting phenomenon. And that speaks to the complexity of the system, of people not even recognizing that how they're benefiting. Anyway, that's a bit of a side note. But not done yet. So now, this is a great example. This school district here, their tax rate is only negligible change from year to year. But it's not actually paying a tax bill. Because now we have something called CLA. So, what is the CLA? So, as I alluded to earlier, as soon as you move to a statewide property tax or any kind of statewide funding system, you have to have some mechanism to equalize the underlying assessed values, because otherwise districts would just be in the system, right? You could, the town of Manchester, as an example, could just, for every house that's worth $100,000, they could just send it $50,000, and the system statewide wouldn't work. So that is the purpose of the CLA, which is really to ensure that property values from town to town are being sort of kept on par with actual market conditions. So the tax department has a process they go through. It's called the equalization study, where they look at, I think it's a rolling 3-year average of sales transactions in every town. They compare all those sales against listed values, and they come up with a ratio. And you're either, that basically tells the tax department and the state whether that town's values statistically are over or under appraised. And that results in a CLA. And that CLA number is then applied on a tax bill as an adjustment. Some towns have it adjust the property value, some have it adjust the education tax rate. You can do it either way, get the same result. I think it's clearer and simpler to just apply it to the property value, because it's more directly, it has nothing to do with the education tax rate. It's all about equalizing property value. That's what it's intended to do. So, if your property, hypothetically, is listed at $100,000, but market conditions indicate that it's really worth $200,000, you're going to see your tax rate adjusted accordingly, or your underlying property value adjusted accordingly to factor that in so that they're not undertaxed. And this, in a lot of communities around Vermont, Manchester certainly one of them, has seen significant increase in selling prices versus listed values. The CLA is really driving the tax rate up. It's not education spending. It's not the education tax rate per se. It's the underlying value of the property. Now, that being said, property values on average across the state are going up, right? The tax base is increasing. And all else being equal, the same average tax rate against an increase in tax base, still nets out to be an increase in taxes.
Can I ask a question? I'm not completely clear about this. We have just had a major revaluation, as you stated, in Manchester. Many properties have gone up massive amounts. I know some people 100%, some people 70%. Maybe it's averaging between 30% and 30%. Now, does that mean the CLA goes up as a result of that? Or does it go down?
So did you have so I'm not familiar with the details, but is it an actual reappraisal?
Yes, the whole area.
Okay, so if it was a reappraisal, then in theory the CLA essentially resets back. There's a little bit of a transition.
So let's say we're 100%, what does that mean then?
So, all right, go ahead.
So I think what's important, I live in Manchester as well, so I'm very familiar, and I'm on the first page of the increase, my house. So what Kath and I talked about this right away was when after the reappraisal, the CLA went up to 122%, which is high. That's significantly above 100. And then when we looked at FY25, it dropped down to like 105 CLA come down, which means that positive effect that all of us thought as Manchester residents we were going to experience, we're not. So that probably doesn't make any sense, but it did go up as it should have, but then because of how it didn't, it's almost as if it didn't go up enough because the homes that were still selling, even though there weren't that many home sales, were still higher, so the CLA dropped.
But doesn't there have to be a proportion before that happens? That can't be. I understand in Manchester, the sales volume went way down. I mean, the amount of the sales was high, but the number of properties transferring went way down. So there's got to be an adjustment.
So I've looked at this formula. I've looked at it a number of years. So there's a very complicated statistical formula that they use to do this, and there's a whole process where they kick out outliers and they correct for things where there isn't statistically significant data, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't speak to the specifics. Obviously, we've had a volatile real estate market in the last few years, and that has done some really wonky things with CLA. And what happens is when your CLA goes above or below a certain threshold, or your COD, which is your coefficient of dispersion, goes beyond 60%. So it's either 20% up or down, or 25%, I think it's 20% up or down on the CLA, or more than 60% of the COD. That triggers a reappraisal. I've seen some towns that have gone through reappraisal, and they've already, like within a year or two, they're already hitting those triggers. It's a real problem. Yes, Jim?
Just one thing that might be helpful, if you look at all of the towns in the Taconic and Green, as one might expect, and it actually makes some sense, we had two towns that were appraised, Manchester and Danby. Almost all of our towns had about the same change in CLA, about a 10-point change in CLA. So, you went to a different base level, but you had a decline of like, 10, 12 in pretty much each of our towns. So the impact on each town's taxes is actually somewhat comparable for the year from the CLA, because Manchester went down by 10, 12, Dorset went down by 10, 12, Danby went down by 10 or 12. So it was relatively consistent across our towns.
So now we zoom back out and look at the big picture and current kind of state of education, finances. So last year the Ed Fund was about $2.15 billion. Billion with a B. This year it's projected to go up to $2.34 billion. It's about $186 million increase in education spending. This gives you a sense of the sources. So it's 72% of education funded. 40% of education funding comes from non-homestead property taxes. Only about 25% comes from homestead property taxes, net of income sensitivity adjustments. And then we've got 736 million coming from various consumption taxes, minimum sales and use tax, etc. So big numbers. So I started with the perfect storm. I'm going to close with the perfect storm. So, 1960s, we had a very different set of challenges. We had normally significant population growth. We had a lot of sort of antiquated facilities, one-room schoolhouses, high schools with 38 students, and brought about huge change in the system, brought about a lot of capital investment. And here we are 60 years later with a new perfect storm. We've had, significant inflationary pressures, in all of our lives, and the education system is certainly not immune to that. We had a ton of federal money, well over $200 million in federal ESSER funds coming into the state that went directly to school districts. So if you remember back to my presentation about how there's sort of taxable and non-taxable sort of revenues, this money that came in kind of came in below the line, wasn't subject to the education tax funding formula. A lot of districts, not our local district, I would hasten to say, I think they were really responsible with their budgeting, but there were a lot of districts who took that money, and instead of using it as one-time money, they built it in their base. And money's gone. And they've already built it in their base, and they just keep on spending it. So that has created a real challenge for us. Employee costs are at least 70%, maybe more, maybe higher, but at least 70% of education spending is employee costs. So it's a labor-intensive business, say nothing, set it aside and deferred maintenance, which I'll come to in a second. Healthcare premiums are up 16%. So that's a right there, you've got a big increase. So, coming back to the perfect storm of the 1960s era, we built all these beautiful buildings out there. They're all coming to the end of their useful life. At pretty much the peak of borrowing costs. So we've got schools out there that are contaminated with PCBs. You probably heard about Vermont. They've had to go out and bond for $165 million high school. That's just one high school. $165 million they've got to bond for in this environment with these interest rates. Painful. We've got schools across the state with boilers that are dying. They're just doing their best to slap duct tape on this stuff. And these are all costs, right? They're all coming due. Recruitment and retention of staff, sort of workforce challenges. I talked before about the 1960s where there were over 10,000 kids being educated by nuns in parochial schools. We actually had, I went to Career Memorial. We actually had nuns in Career Memorial when I was there. And they were cheap. There aren't very many of them around anymore. And we just have a real problem retaining and recruiting workforce in general, particularly in education. And then Act 127. So we increased tax capacity, right? So we gave a lot of school districts, more students that they could count, which reduced their spending, which in theory gave them additional tax capacity to spend more money. And at the same time, the districts that were really penalized by Act 127, we provided this little cap and we said, hey, as a sort of a way to sort of ease the pain, we'll hold you harmless for any tax increases over 5%. And there are a lot of districts who looked at this and had many months of budget planning to realize that this was their golden ticket to go spend money. And there was a school district I was reading up in Chittenden County. They actually sent a letter out, I still have a copy of it. They sent a letter out to their voters, and they essentially said, we have free money. We've padded our budget with $5 million because we don't have to pay for it. Somebody else has to pay for it. Well, guess who somebody else is? It's everybody. Which goes back to my point about we have a system where everyone's in control. So, as I mentioned before, I have the benefit of being a morning quarterback. I don't have to solve all these problems. So that concludes my presentation.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Make a few comments.
Yes.
So, just some bare facts. Google this research.
Yep.
I hope that they're accurate. We spend $2.3 billion in Vermont.
Yep.
We have the lowest pupil-teacher ratio in the country, more or less 10.3 pupils per teacher in the state. We have the lowest performance in student performance, the lower bottom quartile of the USA. Why is that? We spend all that money, and it's very simple to solve this problem. Simple. Build your new schools, close 3 to build 1, and consolidate and cut costs. It's as simple as that. And then everything will take care of itself. And the question is, are we as the voters going to be less lethargic is going to be capable of making major changes?
Great questions. I wouldn't quibble with your first two facts. I might quibble, and I'm sure others with the last one on student performance. I don't think we're last, but
It's the lower quartile
okay. Maybe.
performance.
I'm not sure about that, but
In the state, I'm not talking about it. I'm not talking about the state. In the
I'm
state.
going
In
to talk
the
about that
state.
anyway, so.
okay. So what I'll say, I will go back to your point about the voters, right? So I go back to my example of Montpelier and Roxbury, right? They're having that difficult conversation right now. They have 2 elementary school buildings, and one of them has enough room to absorb all the kids from the other. And they're voting to cut $1 million out of the budget, which we as a state will benefit from through that exercise if they make that choice, right? They've already voted the budget down once, and this is the solution. So I think we're starting to see that some of that play out. Second point, I'll let Kathleen and Seth speak to this. Part of what the legislature is doing right now, recognizing that we've got $6 billion in deferred maintenance, we cannot afford as a state to just go rebuild everything as is. It wouldn't make any sense to do that. So they are having conversations about how to be smart about how to allocate a state capital construction aid in the future. With that in mind. With that,
Karen, what's your question for
Yes, just one, I've just come across the fact that Vermont is the 5th most expensive state to live in the country. And if you go back to where education was in Vermont, maybe in the 70s or whatever, you ranked in the top 5 places in the country. I mean, we were up there. Now it seems that we're spending money, again, we're in the top 5, I believe, you would know more than I would, of the state spending this amount of money per student. And we're ranked somewhere around 15th in the state. So I just have to, in my head, it's very difficult for me to put all these things together, that the little state of Vermont is the 5th most expensive place to live in the U.S. We're spending money like it's going out of style. And maybe we have to stop and regroup and rethink the whole thing, or we're going to ruin the state.
Let me, why don't I talk a little bit about some of the steps the legislature's taken this year and things that we're thinking about doing in the future. Seth and I can kind of divide and conquer here on this, but we'll keep Oliver around for complicated questions about our education funding system because he really is a pro. So Oliver talked a little bit about the perfect storm of 2024, and I think probably folks remember that at one point this fall, education spending was projected to rise by maybe even as much as $250 million across the state, which is a very scary prospect, I think, for all of us. We've gone through the reasons a little bit at the end of the federal ESSER dollars, rising healthcare premiums, rising student mental health needs, inflation, the need to replace our aging school buildings. So we're dealing with this kind of perfect storm of rising upward pressure on the education fund. And this has led to, I would say, fiery debate in the legislature this year. It has been along with housing, which we talk about every year, it has been hands down the hot topic. And the tension has been, what, if anything, can we do right now to provide property tax relief, in the face of big bills that we're all going to be looking at getting? What can we do right now, if anything, to provide immediate property tax relief? What can we do in the medium term to try to make some changes in the next 2 years? And then, more importantly, how can we really overhaul our education funding system to get better results for more affordable costs? And I think everybody understands that we need to do that. And so that's been sort of the tension this year. And our goal has been to try to find some kind of balanced path forward. So some of the things we've done in the very short term, and the legislature hasn't adjourned yet, and so a lot of the bills or initiatives that I'm talking about, maybe the House has passed them, nothing is done for real until we adjourn and we know what made it across the finish line. But one of the bills that the House passed this year, we passed it last year as well, we passed it again this year, was to pause our PCB testing and remediation program. That's a controversial decision, not everybody agrees with that. But a couple of years ago, at the very last minute, the Senate put into the budget a requirement that every school built in Vermont before 1980 would have to test for PCBs and then take steps to remediate if PCBs were found above a certain level. It was put into the budget at the last minute. The House tried to take it out. You know, we fight between ourselves sometimes, the House and Senate. It remained in, and the PCB testing and remediation program went forward. We put some federal pandemic money aside to try to help schools that found PCBs. Last year, we put a little bit more state money into it as the federal money started to dry up. But we're out of money now for the PCB testing program. So anything more that is found is going to roll into that education fund, right, and push those dollars upward. So the House keeps voting to pause that program. I hope that this year the Senate takes heed. You will hear people saying, and this is a legitimate point, it's why nothing is easy. PCBs are carcinogens, they are toxic. Why should we stop this program? If PCBs are found in our schools, we have to deal with that. It's a step we're considering, right? Should we pause the PCB program while we take a look at our school buildings in a more holistic sense? I think yes. Another bill we passed is to create cooperative boards of cooperative education services. I really hope the Senate passes this one. This would allow regional districts and SUs to join together to put into place regional agreements for big cost-saving things like transportation, like administrative services. What can we look at as a region where we can all band together and save money on things that are common to all of these districts? New York has a BOCES program. I believe it's successful over there. We're trying to see whether we could get that system in place here so that our districts and SUs can start big cost-sharing agreements across bigger regions. That holds some promise to save some money. School construction aid, this is huge. Anthony was talking about this. This is a big one. In 2007, Vermont ended its state construction aid program. We used to provide, I think, 30%. So if a district needed to do major renovations or, replace a building, the state would kick in 30%. The school would budget a bond for the rest, and it helped the districts provide for the ongoing maintenance or renovation or replacement of their buildings. In 2007, we ended that state program. And since then, districts have pretty much been on their own to try to bond. That has resulted in more deferred maintenance, right? Districts less able to pass bonds to do necessary renovation or maintenance work. And the only thing I think that qualifies for a little bit of state aid right now is that if you have an emergency. But ongoing maintenance, ongoing replacement of buildings, there's been no state program. So a report, we're very good at reports, came in, and in 2021, we asked every single district in the state to do a really comprehensive inventory and assessment of their capital needs, building by building. That all got balled up into a big report which showed really actually a shocking estimated cost of $300 million a year for ongoing renovation needs over the next 20 years. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we passed a bill this year, again it's pending in the Senate, that would kick off the work by providing districts and SUs with grants to try to do a master plan. So at least make sure that districts and SUs are taking a really thoughtful look at what their construction or renovation needs are going to be and trying to get some grant money to do a professional master plan. We're trying to pre-certify architects and engineers Oh, the grants, yes. The grant program is not very expensive.
Right.
The cost of the actual work, we're going to have to figure out how to pay for that. And so what we've done so far, in the interest of not trying to move so quickly, is we've started basically a state construction aid task force. They're taking a heavy-duty look at this issue. They're going to come back with a plan. They're working with the state treasurer. And the idea is to try to figure out how we can get some sort of state aid program back in place, how districts and taxpayers are going to afford this, and most importantly, how we are going to pay for it. Because there's not an answer to that right now. So it's something that we're going to have to wait and see what options we have before us. That's going to be a matter for, basically future legislature. That's kind of hanging out there. We're trying to take it step by step. We know what districts need. We've got the assessment. We know we probably need to return some sort of state aid to help bonds get passed. We want thoughtful master plans. And I think the most important thing about this is that what's really clear in every bill we've passed so far and in the task force is that incentives are going to be provided, carrots are going to be provided for newer and fewer, for closing school buildings, for consolidating, for saying, as hard as this is, we don't need 3 elementary schools, we can do 2. We're not going to continue to pump money into this aging building. It's going to be cheaper for us to build, maybe a new consolidated union high school. And so I think everybody understands really clearly exactly what you said, Anthony, that as all these buildings start to age out, and as we start to move forward as a state, we have got to take a really hard look at the footprint of our system and take a look at our facilities and figure out how to consolidate, close buildings, build better, smarter, consolidate. It's going to be a huge issue. Yeah.
Just one more question. On the school lunch program, where you're providing lunch to all the students in Vermont, how much does that cost?
The school lunch, I should have
60
printed that out.
60 million.
It's not 60
I
million.
think it's 20, yeah.
The school lunch program was originally anticipated to cost about $30 million. One thing that we said when we passed that bill and added that cost into the education fund was that we believed it would help us to basically draw down more federal education lunch money, for lack of a better word, and that has proven to be the case. So the cost of that program has dropped to $24 million. There are a lot of benefits it's providing in terms of fighting food insecurity. Kids are eating more school lunches, they're eating healthier school lunches. But the answer to your question right now, Carol, is $24 million.
24 million.
Eric?
I would just like to point out that that budget increase that Oliver showed is 8.6% year over year. That is very high. How are we going to try to put a lid on that, get that down to at least the inflation rate?
So that's going to bring us in a sec to our next, I guess, to the part of the conversation that Seth is going to talk about. But there's nothing, right now, the fundamental tension in our system that Oliver talked about, and that I think makes it really hard for the legislature to grapple with this, is that the legislature sets tax rates necessary to provide each district with the money that its voters approved. And that is a fundamental reality of the kind of hybrid system Vermont has right now of everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. So, voters all over the state every year consider their local school budgets. Here in our Taconic and Green, our board worked very, very, very hard this year to bring in a responsible budget with only I believe, a 6% projected increase in the face of wild inflationary costs. 16% healthcare increase, rising inflation across the board, the rising cost to recruit and keep our teachers, and even facing all those inflationary pressures, they still brought in a 6% increase. across the state were not able to do that. And voters approved that budget with, what, 72% approval. So you have that scenario playing out all over the state, right? Local voters are approving their budgets. You add it all up. You add things across the top that come like reimbursement for special ed, grants for transportation, school meals, and the legislature has to take a look at, here, we're getting this much from the lottery, we're getting this much from sales tax, we're getting this much from a little percentage of rooms and meals. We need to set rates to raise that amount that voters have told us they need.
One other question, we have a lot of these costs are mandated by the Vermont State School Board through rules and regulations. There was an estimate in the paper that added about $100 million to the school budgets.
The State Board of Education doesn't mandate any
They set
expenses.
up a lot of rules that they have to implement. I can send you the list.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take a look at it. I mean, that's not the role of the State Board of Ed. So send me the list, Eric, and I'm happy to write it back. So, yeah, I'll take a few more and then I'm going to get back to
The homestead exemption, where does that, I mean, if you make less than $125,000 a year, you get a reduction in your taxes. So how does that fit into the big list?
So that actually brings me perfectly to my next point. So we have this tension, right? Voters vote budgets. The legislature sets the rate necessary to fund budgets that the voters approve. What can we do to try to bring down costs, contain costs? Well, as I mentioned, we can try to do very smart surgical things. We can help districts set up BOCES to share expenses and bring down expenses. We can take a very hard look, and this is going to be a multi-year process, at our buildings and our facilities. I think that's going to be central to the conversation. And this year, we did a couple of things in the short term. One is the 5% cap. I know all of the slides are gone, but the 5% cap that we included as part of the waiting bill definitely turned out to be a mistake. We repealed that earlier this year. We saw the impact it was having, right? Everybody was spending up. And when we saw the impact that was having on all of our property tax rates and on the size of the education fund, we repealed it. And we encouraged districts to, that needed to, or felt that they should, to rewarn and revoke their budgets. It wasn't necessary here to want to be green, but other districts around the state are seeing that play out. They're taking spending out of their budgets, they're voting, they're re-voting. So those were two things we did in the immediate. On Tuesday, we are going to be passing this year's yield bill. It's interesting, it'll probably change once it gets over to the Senate because so many budgets around the state are still in flux. But we were able to pass a yield bill that at this point right now will show a projected average property tax increase of about 15%, down from the 18 or higher percent that we had feared at the beginning of the year. Keeping in mind, there's not a whole lot the legislature can do in one session to bring down property tax rates for the year that is happening right now. Just budgets are being voted. Voters are going in polls. So we set rates that are lower than we had at first feared. That's a good thing. One thing we did for property, for people who pay based on their income, I think 66% of Vermonters qualify to pay based on their income instead of on the value we've had an exemption, a sales tax exemption, if you download it from the cloud. So if you go to get TurboTax, from the internet, or you download Adobe Creative software from the internet. So we've repealed that exemption. So now you're going to pay sales tax on TurboTax whether you buy it at a store or download it from the cloud. That does provide immediate property tax relief this year for our folks who are paying homestead property tax.
But the consumer is paying for that, right?
Yeah.
So it's just raising
It's
more
cost
revenue.
shifting. Yeah, it's cost shifting. It's trying to shift a little bit. The pain right now, the major pain right now, is for property taxpayers. And so we were looking for ways to find a little bit of relief there by shifting it to a broader base tax so that, you and I will pay a little bit more if we download.
I just asked one more question.
Uh-huh.
I'm not gonna go, but,
Yeah, we're going to shift
there's-
this.
why can't we return to a situation where the state collects the taxes and gives a certain amount of money to all the school districts on a per pupil with all the stuff loaded in on it? And anything over that then is up to the district if they want to spend more money, or is that just unfair again and the whole thing is the Brigham decision says you can't do that? I mean, some states do that still, and they're getting away with it. I'm not saying get away with it, but maybe it's a more equitable way to hold down costs.
Well, I'm smiling only because that is a perfect baton to Seth. The only thing I was going to say is we need to return to some different way of funding our schools. If there's anything I learned, and I think we all learned from the 5% cap this year, it's that we cannot slap a major overhaul of our education funding system onto the yield bill, in 2 weeks as it's moving through the House and Senate. It's just, this work is really important, and it's going to take, I think, some really deep work over the next couple of years and make sure that everybody is at the table. Voters, taxpayers, superintendents, school boards, principals. And with that, Mike, you provided a perfect segue to Seth.
So actually, like, that is not a crazy part, because we remember that slide, the one slide that showed the 75% coming from all the other taxes, and only about 25% coming from the homestead taxes. That's the place you have to do something with. And our districts are now bigger, but they tend to be more equal within themselves than they used to be. And so thinking about a system that does something close to what you're thinking about is not crazy. And it's on, it would have to pass a rate test. So it would have to, but the notion, one of the problems like now is all I've said a few times, everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. We need to come out of this with a system where, in the end, where somebody's in charge. And we have to come out of this in the end with a system where people make decisions at the local level. If you look at what happened here with the Divine Green, very responsible budget. Very responsible budget, and yet our taxes are going up a lot higher than what the budget would otherwise indicate. And that's because of decisions being made by others. And that, that's where we need to bring that back. Oh, I'll say another thing before I start on this. The other thing is that in crisis, there's always opportunity. And the fact that we have this issue with aging schools and we have this crisis actually is going to help. I think in the end, as we think this through, do some force some consolidation that people think will make sense, which will then help make sense in the long run, and help in the long run across. So it makes sense from the construction perspective, and it makes sense from the population perspective. So buried in the crisis, there may be an opportunity. We'll have to see how that plays out. Yeah, go ahead.
Seth, it seems to me there hasn't been much consolidation of Vermont schools since the invention of the school bus. We can do so much there. Secondly, since the invention of the school bus, before people want to send uphill both ways, in top of that, the slide shows we've been fighting this very complicated funding model for at least 62 years based on that, 1962 to now. I'm an immigrant, but I think I understand there's about 50 United States in the United States, 50 states. Can't you go out and look for the shining star that's doing it better than anybody else and try to copy them and learn something from, rather than keep on reinventing the wheel that doesn't work?
Well, yes. And actually, we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's one of the things coming out of the session out of the yield bill.
Services $4 or $5 billion underfunded teachers' pension plan.
Yeah, I didn't.
Another thing that hasn't been paid for.
But it hasn't been paid for, but we did make a real dent, we made a real dent in that a couple of years ago.
Very tiny.
No, it's more than a little tiny, it's more than a tiny. But, so, the bill that we're getting, Kathleen mentioned that we're voting on, it's going to be voting on Tuesday and Wednesday, will establish a blue ribbon task force. Apropos your comment about lobbies continuing, we're trying to bring that to the deal. So it's envisioned by the House, it's a 23-member task force. It will be led by a steering committee and work with a consultant. It includes membership from all the key school associations like the Vermont School Boards Association, Principals Association, School Business Managers Association, etc. And I'll have to say, one member will be from the Vermont Independent School Association, and I'll have to say that's because of the academy. We fought for that. They weren't going to put that in. They didn't want that in there, and we pulled every lever that we had available and did what we could to make that happen so that independent schools are represented on that. So the group will have a steering committee. It will work with an expert school funding consultant who will be required to consult with key groups like the Department of Mental Health, etc. So the goal, here's the goal. The goal is to create a statewide vision for our public schools, pre-K through 12. Public hearings will be held around the state in every region. Consider key things like how public schools are governed and the role of the AOE, how the State Board of Education is set up and what its role should be, the best way to run our career tech ed centers, how many school buildings we need, whether and how to consolidate our physical footprint, how many teachers and staff do we need. The money's in the staff, and recommendations for how the classes should be. Easier said than done in a rural state. We shouldn't forget, but anyway, how big classes should be, what role schools should play in student mental health and providing support services, and how we fund and pay for our schools. We need a new formula. And included in this is the future of the town tuition program, and there's a danger in it for us. So I'll come back to that in a minute. It asks for two things. It goes on until October of 25. It does ask in the interim, halfway through, actually even quicker than halfway through, December of 24. Short-term cost savings that they might envision is due in December of 24. With the final report, how to reinvent the wheel, is due in October of 25. And in the short run, as Kath mentioned, we have several pieces of legislation that could have managed the cost of our school buildings. We do the PCB pause, for better or for worse, but the PCB pause, the school construction task force, and requirements that the Blue Ribbon task force consider this to. School consolidation and closure needs to be smart, how to renovate. And then third, another huge challenge is the cost of health care. That 16% is actually a lot more than 16% because it's 16% on top of 16% last year. That's the new base, another 16%, then that's the new base, another 16%. And the cost of health care is really driving a large driver of what's going on with the cost for our employees. It's a national and statewide challenge. A few years ago, Governor Scott, as requested Governor Scott, the legislature voted to move health
council use that term. I know, yeah, so that's what, it's actually written into the bill as a town tuition program.
So, you know, this is on top of the Carson, the Macon Supreme Court decision, which held that if the state pays tuition dollars to any independent school, it must pay tuition dollars to all independent schools, including religious schools. That's an issue. We've been trying to figure out a workaround for that that's going to allow us to keep our system intact. But that started a drumbeat, and now we have this happening at the same time, and it is going to take, already, frankly, it's taking just about, I say every drop, we do other things too, it's almost taking every drop of our energy in the legislature to deal with this. That's what we spend. You haven't been hearing as much about it this year because nothing has quite bubbled to the surface. Underneath the surface is really intense. And we are under a ton of pressure. Just a handful of us trying to hang on to the system we have. And this task force is frankly going to be another vehicle for cutting outs on that. So that's, I just want you to be aware of that and looking at the time it's going to become incredibly applied, and we have to be ready to stand for this. We're doing it literally every day. It's going to come to the community by so I think I'll leave it at that. So, you know, I think in the end, it's just for me, I posted some think about this going forward. You know, hopefully we can come up with a system that's understandable for people who have grown. Would help a lot if people actually understood why this is happening.
Is that one of the mandates of the task force to make the, oh, no, that's too bad.
But anyway, so that's, I'll leave it at that.
I just wanted to,
Do we know what school costs is going up with around the United States, not just in Vermont? We have 15%. What's the average out there?
I don't know.
Because most of the cost factors we are against, the whole country's up against. Hiring, inflation, and healthcare, so on. It's the same for everybody, not just Vermont.
Yeah, no, other schools, other states, though, for instance, not all, but some are, the higher populations, a lot easier to have 20 kids in the classroom. So the rural nature of Vermont is a challenge. It's always been a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge.
What do you think the student population will be in the future? I mean, it has dwindled, and I think with the expense of just living here, and the expense of the taxes and increases of taxes, increases of property taxes, no housing, what do you think the student population will look like? And is that being under consideration for 5 years?
That one slide, all it shows, I hadn't seen that before, that's scary, actually.
Yeah, it was like I wrote it down, 82,000.
No, not that one, that one's scary, but the other one showed.
Birth rate.
Yeah.
And so
but that's not just Vermont,
I
that's.
know it's not. That's also what also is Vermont. And it's hard to have more kids here if there's no place to live. No housing.
But I think also it's a tremendous amount of pressure even for the parents that do live here and work here, of school-age children and high school students to try to maintain. I mean, if you just drove by the gas pump today, it went up 30 cents from yesterday. That's real. I just saw that. I was like, oh my gosh, the gas went up again. You know, let alone the cost of food. And so I think that should really be brought up at the legislature. I mean, talk about mental health issues and stability for families. I mean, all these taxes can be really difficult for average people or even above average people to afford, let alone everything else that they need to do. So that's like the real thing. I mean, you can talk about all this very abstract stuff, which a lot of people, I don't understand all, you know, the formulas that you have to do at the state. I appreciate all the work you do, but in reality, I mean, thinking of the real quality of life that people have to maintain.
The money is in the schools, it's in, as a business,
I just want to emphasize that if there were an easy answer, and if there were a simple solution, we would have done it. So, everybody cares deeply about our schools, everybody cares deeply about our kids, everybody cares deeply about school spending and our property taxes. Every one of us here in this room looking around, I think we are all Manchester property taxpayers, as am I. But unfortunately, these are, as we saw tonight, it is an incredibly complicated formula. It is not easy to fix. There is no way we can fix it without taking the time we need to make sure that the fix we propose is the right one and that it's going to work. I think that would be a huge mistake. And I think it's so right for you to wrap it up by saying it's everything. And it's why all of these things are so hard to solve. It's the cost of property taxes is what we're here to talk about today because it's a concrete topic, and it's the one we're all feeling very acutely this year. So today we're here to talk about property taxes. Another huge crisis that Vermont is facing, that we've been working on and working on and working on, and it's going to take years to solve, is the cost of housing. That's all part of the big bucket that we're all driving around, right? The cost of healthcare. Many of those, that's a national crisis. Many of those drivers are well beyond the purview of the Vermont State Legislature to fix. And then just inflation. The cost of groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of clothes, the cost of everything. Well beyond our purview, but it adds to the sense that we all can't afford our lives anymore. And so we have to try to make change where, we have to try to make change where we can. We have to try to look at school spending. We have to try to make progress on the housing crisis. We have to try to make childcare more affordable, which we've done. We have to look at Act 250 to make it easier to build housing. It's a gigantic, very complicated Rubik's Cube. And I'm glad we're at least here today to talk about what steps we can try to make in a thoughtful way that moves things along as quickly as we can without making a big mistake that we have to go back and redo to try to make Vermont a thriving and more affordable place to live for all of us.
I would like to take the opportunity to thank Kath and Seth and Oliver for coming out on Sunday night and help develop our understanding of something that's very difficult to still understand, but we appreciate it very much. Just take it.